Hello, now you can hear me. Welcome everybody to my reading stream. It's been a while since I've had one of these, like a little over a month. And I never finished the last book that I was on, so obviously I need to finish that. So thank you for being here. If this is your first time at one of my reading streams, I just kind of want to let you know. Let me move my hair actually. That's bothering me. That's better. If this is your first time at one of my reading streams, I just want to let you know that the format is a little bit different than my game streams. When I'm playing a game, I can talk very freely back and forth when the chat comes up. However, when I'm reading, oh, hey, Mature, good to see you again. When I'm reading, I don't want to interrupt the story for the sake of chatting back and forth. So I want you guys to chat or not. That's fine. It's cool if you just enjoy it. However, at the end of each chapter, that will be when I check the chat to kind of catch up on what's been going on in the chat. So if I ignore you for a little while, please don't feel bad. Please don't be upset with me. It's just kind of the way it works, and I kind of want the chapters to be able to flow. All right, so without further ado, we're picking back up with the second book in a series of unfortunate events, The Reptile Room. We've read through chapter 9, so today I will be finishing the book by reading chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13. So, I hope you guys enjoy. Chapter 10. When you were very small, perhaps someone read to you the insipid story, the word insipid here means not worth reading to anyone, of the boy who cried wolf. A very dull boy, you may remember, cried "Wolf!" when there was no wolf, and the gullible villagers ran to rescue him only to find the whole thing was a joke. Then he cried "Wolf!" when it wasn't a joke, and the villagers didn't come running, and the boy was eaten, and the story, thank goodness, was over. The story's moral, of course, ought to be never live somewhere where wolves are running around loose, but whoever read you the story probably told you that the moral was not to lie. This is an absurd moral, for you and I both know that sometimes not only is it good to lie, it's necessary to lie. For example, it was perfectly appropriate after Violet left the reptile room for Sunny to crawl over to the cage that held the incredibly deadly viper, unlatch the cage, and begin screaming as loudly as she could, even though nothing was really wrong. There is another story concerning wolves that someone has probably read to you, which is just as absurd. I'm talking about Little Red Riding Hood, an extremely unpleasant little girl who, like the boy who cried wolf, insisted on intruding on the territory of dangerous animals. You will recall that the wolf, after being treated very rudely by Little Red Riding Hood, ate the little girl's grandmother and put on her clothing as a disguise. It is this aspect of the story that is the most ridiculous, because one would think that even a girl as dim-witted as Little Red Riding Hood could tell in an instant the difference between her grandmother and a wolf dressed in nightgown and fuzzy slippers. If you know someone very well, like your grandmother or your baby sister, you will know when they are real and when they are fake. This is why as Sunny began to scream, Violet and Klaus could tell immediately that her scream was absolutely fake. "That scream is absolutely fake," Klaus said to himself from the other end of the reptile room. "That scream is absolutely fake," Violet said to herself from the stairs as she went up to her room. "My lord, something is terribly wrong," Mr. Poe said to himself from the kitchen where he was talking on the phone. "Goodbye," he said into the receiver, hung up, and ran out of the kitchen to see what the matter was. "What's the matter?" Mr. Poe asked Stefano and Dr. Lucafont, who had finished unloading the suitcases and were entering the house. "I heard some screams coming from the reptile room." "I'm sure it's nothing," Stefano said. "You know how children are," Dr. Lucafont said. "We can't have another tragedy on our hands," Mr. Poe said, and rushed to the enormous door of the reptile room. "Children? Children?" "In here!" Klaus cried. "Come quickly!" His voice was rough and low, and anyone who didn't know Klaus would think he was very frightened. If you did know Klaus, however, you would know that when he was very frightened his voice became tense and squeaky, as it did when he discovered Uncle Monty's body. His voice became rough and low when he was trying not to laugh. It's a very good thing that Klaus managed not to laugh as Mr. Poe, Stefano, and Dr. Lucafont came into the reptile room. It would have spoiled everything. Sunny was lying down on the marble floor, her tiny arms and legs waving wildly as if she were trying to swim. Her facial expression was what made Klaus want to chuckle. Sunny's mouth was wide open, showing her 4 sharp teeth, and her eyes were blinking rapidly. She was trying to appear very frightened, and if you didn't know Sunny, it would have seemed genuine. But Klaus did know Sunny, and he knew that when she was very frightened, Sorry. Klaus did know Sunny, and knew that when she was very frightened her face grew all puckered and silent, as it did when Stefano had threatened to cut off one of her toes. To anyone but Klaus, Sunny looked as if she were very frightened, particularly because of who she was with. For wrapped around Sunny's small body was a snake, as dark as a coal mine and as thick as a sewer pipe. It was looking at Sunny with shiny green eyes, and its mouth was open as if it were about to bite her. "The incredibly deadly viper!" Klaus cried. "It's going to bite her!" Klaus screamed, and Sunny opened her mouth and eyes even wider to seem even more scared. Dr. Lucafont's mouth opened too, and Klaus saw him start to say something, but he was unable to find words. Stefano, who of course could not have cared less about Sunny's well-being, at least looked surprised, but it was Mr. Poe who absolutely panicked. There are two basic types of panicking: standing still and not saying a word, and leaping all over the place babbling anything that comes into your head. Mr. Poe was the leaping and babbling kind. Klaus and Sunny had never seen the banker move so quickly or talk in such a high-pitched voice. "Goodness!" he cried. "Golly! Good God! Blessed Allah! Zeus and Hera! Mary and Joseph! Nathaniel Hawthorne! Don't touch her! Oh, grab her! Move closer! Run away! Don't move! Kill the snake! Leave it alone! Give it some food and don't let it bite her! Lure the snake away! Here, Snakey! Here, Snakey, Snakey!" The incredibly deadly viper listened patiently to Mr. Poe's speech, never taking its eyes off of Sunny, and when Mr. Poe paused to cough into his handkerchief, it leaned over and bit Sunny on the chin, right where it had bitten her when the two friends had first met. Klaus tried not to grin, but Dr. Lucafont gasped, Stefano stared, and Mr. Poe began leaping and babbling again. "It's bitten her!" he cried. "It bit her! It bited her! Calm down! Get moving! Call an ambulance! Call the police! Call a scientist! Call my wife! This is terrible! This is awful! This is ghastly! This is phantasmagorical! This is nothing to worry about," Stefano interrupted smoothly. "What do you mean, nothing to worry about?" Mr. Poe asked incredulously. "Sunny was just bitten by—" "What's the name of the snake, Klaus?" "The incredibly deadly viper," Klaus answered promptly. "The incredibly deadly viper!" Mr. Poe repeated, pointing to the snake as it held onto Sunny's chin with its teeth. Sunny gave another fake shriek of fear. "How could you say it's nothing to worry about?" "Because the incredibly deadly viper is completely harmless," Stefano said. "Calm yourself, Poe. The snake's name is a misnomer that Dr. Montgomery created for his own amusement." "Are you sure?" Mr. Poe asked. His voice got a little lower, and he moved a bit more slowly as he began to calm down. "Of course I'm sure," Stefano said, and Klaus recognized a look on his face he remembered from living at Count Olaf's. It was a look of sheer vanity, a word which here means Count Olaf thinking he's the most incredible person who ever lived. When the Baudelaire orphans had been under Olaf's care, he had often acted this way, always happy to show off his skills, whether he was on stage with his atrocious theater company or up in his tower room making nasty plans. Stefano smiled and continued to speak to Mr. Poe, eager to show off. "The snake is perfectly harmless, friendly even. I read up on the incredibly deadly viper and many other snakes in the library section of the Reptile Room, as well as Dr. Montgomery's private papers." Dr. Lucafont cleared his throat. Boss?" he said. "Don't interrupt me, Dr. Lucafont," Stefano said. "I studied books on all the major species. I looked carefully at sketches and charts. I took careful notes and looked them over each night before I went to sleep. If I may say so, I consider myself to be quite the expert on snakes." "Aha!" Sunny cried, disentangling herself from the incredibly deadly viper. "Sunny, you're unharmed!" Mr. Poe cried. "Aha!" Sunny cried again, pointing at Stefano. The incredibly deadly viper blinked its green eyes triumphantly. Mr. Poe looked at Klaus, puzzled. "What does your sister mean by aha?" he asked. Klaus sighed. He felt sometimes as if he had spent half his life explaining things to Mr. Poe. "By aha," he said, "she means, one minute Stefano claims he knows nothing about snakes, the next he claims he's an expert. By aha, she means Stefano has been lying to us. By aha, she means we finally exposed his dishonesty to you. By aha, she means aha!" It's the end of chapter 10. My girlfriend just started to watch the series on Netflix, didn't know she was doing it, but suddenly I knew the story and I had to think real hard from where, as I hadn't seen the series at all. That's awesome. Yeah, I was hoping, and I was able to get the first book read before the series aired. I was hoping to get a couple books done, but life got in the way, so I haven't been able to stream as much as I wanted. But that's awesome. Cool. Chapter 11. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Violet was upstairs, surveying her bedroom with a critical eye. She took a deep breath and then tied her hair in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes. As you and I and everyone who's familiar with Violet know, when she ties her hair back like that, it's because she needs to think up an invention. And right now she needed to think of one quickly. Violet had realized when her brother had talked about Stefano ordering them to carry his suitcase into the house, that the evidence she had been looking for was undoubtedly in that very suitcase. And now, while her siblings were distracting the adults in the reptile room, would be her only opportunity to open the suitcase and retrieve proof of Stefano's evil plot. But her aching shoulder was a reminder that she simply couldn't open the suitcase. It was locked, with a lock as shiny as Stefano's scheming eyes. I confess that if I were in Violet's place, with only a few minutes to open a locked suitcase instead of on the desk of my friend Bela's yacht writing this down, I probably would have given up hope. I would have sunk to the floor of the bedroom and pounded my fists against the carpet, wondering why in the world life was so unfair and filled with inconveniences. Luckily for the Baudelaires, however, Violet was made of sterner stuff, and she took a good look around her bedroom for anything that might help her. There wasn't much in the way of inventing materials. Violet longed for a good room in which to invent things, filled with wires and gears and all the necessary equipment to invent really top-notch devices. Uncle Monty was in fact in possession of many of these supplies, but to Violet's frustration as she thought of this, they were located in the reptile room. She looked at the pieces of butcher paper tacked to the wall, where she had hoped to sketch out inventions as she lived in Uncle Monty's house. The trouble had begun so quickly that Violet had only a few scribblings on one of the sheets, which she had written by the light of a floor lamp on her first night here. Violet's eyes traveled to the floor lamp as she remembered that evening, and when she reached the electric socket, she had an idea. We all know, of course, that we should never, ever, 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 goes on for like the entire page, ever, ever fiddle around in any way with electric devices. Never. There are two reasons for this. One is that you can get electrocuted, which is not only deadly, but very unpleasant, and the other is that you are not Violet Baudelaire, one of the few people in the world who know how to handle such things. And even Violet was very careful and nervous as she unplugged the lamp and took a long look at the plug itself. It might work. Hoping that Klaus and Sunny were continuing to stall the adults successfully, Violet wiggled the two prongs of the plug this way and that until at last they came loose from their plastic casing. She now had two small metal strips. Violet then took one of the thumbtacks out of the butcher paper, letting the paper curl down the wall as if it were lazy. With the sharp end of the tack, she poked and prodded the two pieces of metal until one was hooked around the other, and then forced the thumbtack between the two pieces so the sharp end stuck straight out. The result looked like a piece of metal you might not notice if it lay in the street, but in fact what Violet had made was a crude, the word crude here means roughly made at the last minute rather than rude or ill-mannered, lockpick. Lockpicks, as you probably know, are devices that work as if they were proper keys, used usually by bad guys to rob houses or escape from jail, but this was one of the rare times when a lockpick was being used by a good guy, Violet Baudelaire. Violet walked quickly back down the stairs, holding her lockpick in one hand and crossing her fingers with the other. She tiptoed past the enormous door of the reptile room and hoped that her absence would not be noticed as she slipped outside. Deliberately averting her eyes from Dr. Lucafont's car to avoid catching even a glimpse of Uncle Monty's body, the eldest Baudelaire walked toward the pile of suitcases. She looked first at the old ones belonging to the Baudelaires. The suitcases contained, she remembered, lots of ugly, itchy clothing that Mrs. Poe had bought for them soon after their parents died. For a few seconds, Violet found herself staring at the suitcases, remembering how effortless her life had been before all this trouble had set upon them, and how surprising it was to find herself in such miserable circumstances now. This may not be surprising to us because we know how disastrous the lives of the Baudelaire orphans are, but Violet's misfortune was constantly surprising to her, and it took her a minute to push thoughts of their situation out of her head and to concentrate on what she had to do. She knelt down to get closer to Stefano's suitcase, held the shiny silver padlock in one hand, took a deep breath, and stuck the lockpick into the keyhole. It went inside, but when she tried to turn it around it scarcely budged, only scraped a little at the inside of the keyhole. It needed to move more smoothly or it would never work. Violet took her lockpick out and wet it with her mouth, grimacing at the stale taste of the metal. Then she stuck the lockpick into the keyhole again and tried to move it. It wiggled slightly and then lay still. Violet took the lockpick out and thought very, very hard, retying her hair in the ribbon. As she cleared the hair from her eyes, though, she felt a sudden prickle on her skin. It was unpleasant and familiar. It was the feeling of being watched. She looked quickly behind her, but she only saw the snake-shaped hedges on the lawn. She looked to the side, and saw only the driveway leading down to Lousy Lane. But then she looked straight ahead, through the glass walls of the Reptile Room. It had never occurred to her that people could see in through the Reptile Room's walls as clearly as they could see out. But when she looked up, Violet could see, through the cages of reptiles, the figure of Mr. Poe leaping up and down excitedly. You and I know, of course, that Mr. Poe was panicking over Sunny and the incredibly deadly viper, but all Violet knew was whatever ruse her siblings had devised was still working. The prickle on her skin was not explained, however, until she looked a little closer, just to the right of Mr. Poe, and saw that Stefano was looking right back at her. Her mouth fell open in surprise and panic. She knew that any second now Stefano would invent an excuse to leave the reptile room and come find her, and she hadn't even opened the suitcase. Quickly, she had to find some way to make her lockpick work. She looked down at the damp gravel of the driveway and up at the dim yellowish afternoon sun. She looked at her own hands smudged with dust from picking apart the electric plug, and that's when she thought of something. Jumping to her feet, Violet sprinted back into the house as if Stefano were already after her, and pushed her way through the door into the kitchen. Shoving a chair to the floor in her haste, she grabbed a bar of soap from the dripping sink. She rubbed the slippery substance carefully over her lockpick until the entire invention had a thin, slick coating. Her heart pounding in her chest, she ran back outside, taking a hurried look through the walls of the reptile room. Stefano was saying something to Mr. Poe. He was bragging about his expertise of snakes, but Violet had no way of knowing that. And Violet took this moment to kneel down and stick the lockpick back into the keyhole of the padlock. It spun quickly all the way around and then snapped in two right in front of her hands. There was a faint sputter of sound as one half fell to the grass, the other one sticking in the keyhole like a jagged tooth. Her lockpick was destroyed. Violet closed her eyes for a moment in despair and then pulled herself to her feet, using the suitcase to gain her balance. When she put her hand on the suitcase, however, the padlock swung open and the case tipped open and spilled everything all over the ground. Violet fell back down in surprise. Somehow, as the lockpick turned, it must have unstuck the lock. Sometimes even in the most unfortunate of lives there will occur a moment or two of good fortune. It is very difficult, experts have told us, to find a needle in a haystack, which is why needle in a haystack has become a rather hackneyed phrase, meaning something that's difficult to find. The reason it's difficult to find a needle in a haystack, of course, is that out of all the things in a haystack, the needle is only one of them. If, however, you were looking for anything in a haystack, that wouldn't be difficult at all, because once you started sifting through the haystack, you would most certainly find something. Hay, of course, but also dirt, bugs, a few farming tools, and maybe even a man who had escaped from prison and was hiding there. When Violet searched through the contents of Stefano's suitcase, it was more like looking for anything in a haystack because she didn't know exactly what she wanted to find. Therefore, it was actually fairly easy to find useful items of evidence. A glass vial with a sealed rubber cap, as one might find in a scientific laboratory. A syringe with a sharp needle, like the one your doctor uses to give you shots. A small bunch of folded papers, a card laminated in plastic, a powder puff, and a small hand mirror. Even though she knew she only had a few more moments, Violet separated these items from the smelly clothes and the bottle of wine that were also in the suitcase, and looked at all of her evidence very carefully, concentrating on each item as if they were small parts out of which she was going to make a machine. And in a way they were. Violet Baudelaire needed to arrange these pieces of evidence to defeat Stefano's evil plan and bring justice and peace into the lives of the Baudelaire orphans for the first time since their parents perished in the terrible fire. Violet gazed at each piece of evidence, thinking very hard, and before too long her face lit up the way it always did when all the pieces of something were fit together properly and the machine worked just the way it should. That's the end of chapter 11. Ooh, gin tonic and ice. Sounds yummy. Lighting the fireplace. Hi, Farm Sim God. Welcome to the stream. One of your favorite books and series? Mine too. This is my favorite series of all time, and to celebrate the series coming out to Netflix, I've been reading the books through my streams. So welcome. I'm glad you could join us. I hope you're enjoying yourself. Sorry I'm kind of to the end of the book, but hopefully if you already know the series, then it's not too much of a spoiler for you. Moving right along to chapter 12. Actually, I'm going to take a sip of water real quick. Almost done, only 2 more chapters. Chapter 12. I promise you that this is the last time that I will use the phrase meanwhile back at the ranch, but I can think of no other way to return to the moment when Klaus had just explained to Mr. Poe what Sonny had meant by shouting aha, and now everyone in the reptile room was staring at Stefano. Sonny looked triumphant. Klaus looked defiant. Mr. Poe looked furious. Dr. Lucafont looked worried. You couldn't tell how the incredibly deadly viper looked because the facial expressions of snakes are difficult to read. Stefano looked back at all these people silently, his face fluttering as he tried to decide whether to come clean, a phrase which here means admit that he's really Count Olaf and up to no good, or perpetuate his deception, a phrase which here means lie, lie, lie. Stefano, Mr. Poe said and coughed into his handkerchief. Klaus and Sonny waited impatiently for him to continue. Stefano, explain yourself. You have just told us that you are an expert on snakes. Previously, however, you told us you knew nothing of snakes and therefore couldn't have been involved in Dr. Montgomery's death. So which is it? What is going on? When I told you I knew nothing of snakes, Stefano said, I was being modest. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go outside for a moment and... You weren't being modest, Klaus cried. You were lying. And you're lying now. You're nothing but a liar and a murderer. Stefano's eyes grew wide, and his face clouded in anger. You have no evidence of that, he said. Yes, we do, said a voice in the doorway, and everyone turned around to find Violet standing there, with a smile on her face and evidence in her arms. Triumphantly, she walked across the reptile room to the far end, where the books Klaus had been reading about the Mamba du Mal were still stacked in a pile. The others followed her, walking down the aisles of reptiles. Silently, she arranged the objects in a line on top of a table, the glass vial with the sealed rubber cap, the syringe with the sharp needle, the small bunch of folded papers, a card laminated in plastic, the powder puff, and the small hand mirror. What is all this? Mr. Poe said, gesturing to the arrangement. This, Violet said, is evidence, which I found in Stefano's suitcase. My suitcase, Stefano said, is private property, which you are not allowed to touch. It's very rude of you, and besides, it was locked. It was an emergency, Violet said calmly, so I picked the lock. How did you do that? Mr. Poe asked. Nice girls shouldn't know how to do such things. My sister is a nice girl, Klaus said, and she knows how to do all sorts of things. Rufik, Sonny agreed. Well, we'll discuss that later, Mr. Poe said. In the meantime, please continue. When Uncle Monty died, Violet began, my siblings and I were very sad, but we were also very suspicious. We weren't suspicious, Klaus exclaimed. If someone is suspicious, it means they're not sure. We were positive that Stefano killed him. Nonsense, Dr. Lucafont said. As I explained to all of you, Montgomery's death was an accident. The Mamba du Mal escaped from its cage and bit him, and that's all there is to it. I beg your pardon, Violet said, but that's not all there is to it. Klaus read up on the Mamba du Mal and found out how it kills its victims. Klaus walked over to the stack of books and opened the one on top. He had marked his place with a small piece of paper, so he found what he was looking for right away. The Mamba du Mal, he read out loud, is one of the deadliest snakes in the hemisphere, noted for its strangulatory grip, used in conjunction with its deadly venom, giving all of its victims a tenebrous hue, which is ghastly to behold. He put the book down and turned to Mr. Poe. Strangulatory means... We know what the words mean, Stefano shouted. Then you must know, Klaus said, that the Mamba du Mal did not kill Uncle Monty. His body didn't have a tenebrous hue, it was pale as he could be. That's true, Mr. Poe said, but it doesn't necessarily indicate that Dr. Montgomery was murdered. Yes, Dr. Lucafont said, perhaps just this once the snake didn't feel like bruising its victim. But it's more likely, Violet said, that Uncle Monty was killed with these items. She held up the glass vial with the sealed rubber cap. This vial is labeled Venom du Mal, and it's obviously from Uncle Monty's cabinet of venom samples. Then she held up the syringe with the sharp needle. Stefano, Olaf, took this syringe and injected the venom into Uncle Monty. Then he poked an extra hole so it would look like the snake had bitten him. But I loved Dr. Montgomery, Stefano said. I would have nothing to gain from his death. Sometimes when someone tells a ridiculous lie, it is best to ignore it entirely. When I turn 18, as we all know, Violet continued, ignoring Stefano entirely, I inherit the Baudelaire fortune, and Stefano intended to get that fortune for himself. It would be easier to do so if it were in a location that was more difficult to trace, such as Peru. Violet held up the small bunch of folded papers. These are tickets for the Prospero, leaving Hazy Harbor for Peru at 5 o'clock today. That's where Stefano was taking us when we happened to run into you, Mr. Poe. But Uncle Monty tore up Stefano's ticket to Peru, Klaus said, looking confused. I saw him. That's true, Violet said. That's why he had to get Uncle Monty out of the way. He killed Uncle Monty. Violet stopped for a minute and shuddered. He killed Uncle Monty, and he took this laminated card. It's Monty's membership card for the Herpetological Society. Stefano planned to pose as Uncle Monty to get on board the Prospero and whisk us away to Peru. But I don't understand, Mr. Poe said. How did Stefano even know about your fortune? Because he's really Count Olaf, Violet said, exasperated that she had to explain what she and her siblings and you and I knew the moment Stefano arrived at this house. He may have shaved his head and trimmed off his eyebrows, but the only way he could get rid of the tattoo on his left ankle was with this powder puff and hand mirror. There's makeup all over his left ankle to hide the eye, and I'll bet if we rub it with a cloth we can see the tattoo. That's absurd, Stefano cried. We'll see about that, Mr. Poe replied. Now who has a cloth? Not me, Klaus said. Not me, Violet said. Gouil, Sonny said. Well, if nobody has a cloth, we might as well forget the whole thing, Dr. Lucafont said, but Mr. Poe held up a finger to tell him to wait. To the relief of the Baudelaire orphans, he reached into his pocket and withdrew his handkerchief. Your left ankle, please, he said sternly to Stefano. But you've been coughing into that all day, Stefano said. It has germs. If you are really who the children say you are, Mr. Poe said, then germs are the least of your problems. Your left ankle, please. Stefano, and this is the last time, thank goodness, we'll have to call him by his phony name, gave a little growl and pulled up his left pants leg to reveal his ankle. Mr. Poe knelt down and rubbed at it for a few moments. At first nothing appeared to happen, but then, like a sun shining through clouds at the end of a terrible rainstorm, the faint outline of an eye began to appear. Clearer and clearer it grew, until it was as dark as it had been when the orphans first saw it, back when they had lived with Count Olaf. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny all stared at the eye, and the eye stared back, and for the first time in their lives, the Baudelaire orphans were happy to see it. All right, that's the end of chapter 12. Am I reading the whole series? I am going to eventually get through it, yes. I will also be reading some Nancy Drew books here and there, but yeah, I do plan to finish this entire series eventually. I hate Mr. Post so much. Hi, Tom. Good to see you. One more chapter left. You guys ready? Let me take another sip of water. I keep having this, like, tickle in the back of my throat. I hate Mr. Poe so much. You make me laugh sometimes. Okay. Alright. Chapter 13. If this were a book written to entertain small children, you would know what would happen next. With the villain's identity and evil plans exposed, the police would arrive on the scene and place him in a jail for the rest of his life, and the plucky youngsters would go out for pizza and live happily ever after. But this book is about the Baudelaire orphans, and you and I know that these three unfortunate children living happily ever after is about as likely as Uncle Monty returning to life. But it seemed to the Baudelaire orphans, as the tattoo became evident, that at least a little bit of Uncle Monty had come back to them as they proved Count Olaf's treachery once and for all. That's the eye, all right, Mr. Poe said, and stopped rubbing Count Olaf's ankle. You are most definitely Count Olaf, and you are most definitely under arrest. And I am most definitely shocked, Dr. Lucafont said, clapping his oddly solid hands to his head. As am I, Mr. Poe agreed, grabbing Count Olaf's arm in case he tried to run anywhere. Violet, Klaus, Sonny, please forgive me for not believing you earlier. It just seemed too far-fetched that he would have searched you out, disguised himself as a laboratory assistant, and concocted an elaborate plan to steal your fortune. I wonder what happened to Gustav, Uncle Monty's real lab assistant, Klaus wondered out loud. If Gustav hadn't quit, then Uncle Monty would have never hired Count Olaf. Count Olaf had been quiet this whole time, ever since the tattoo had appeared. His shiny eyes had darted this way and that, watching everyone carefully the way a lion will watch a herd of antelope, looking for the one that would be best to kill and eat. But at the mention of Gustav's name, he spoke up. Gustav didn't quit, he said in his wheezy voice. Gustav is dead. One day when he was out collecting wildflowers, I drowned him in the swarthy swamp. Then I forged a note saying he quit. Count Olaf looked at the three children as if he were going to run over and strangle them, but instead he stood absolutely still, which was somehow even scarier. "But that's nothing compared to what I will do to you, orphans. You have won this round of the game, but I will return for your fortune and for your precious skin." "This is not a game, you horrible man," Mr. Poe said. "Dominoes is a game. Water polo is a game. Murder is a crime, and you will go to jail for it. I will drive you to the police station in town right this very minute." "Oh, drat, I can't. My car is wrecked." "Well, I'll take you down in Dr. Montgomery's Jeep, and you children can follow along in Dr. Lucafont's car. I guess you'll be able to see the inside of a doctor's automobile after all." "It might be easier," Dr. Lucafont said, "to put Stefano in my car and have the three children follow behind. After all, Dr. Montgomery's body is in my car, so there's no room for all three children anyway." "Well," Mr. Poe said, "I hate to disappoint the children after they've had such a trying time. We can move Dr. Montgomery's body to the Jeep, and—" "We couldn't care less about the inside of a doctor's automobile," Violet said impatiently. "We only made that up so we wouldn't be trapped alone with Count Olaf." "You shouldn't tell lies, orphans," Count Olaf said. "I don't think you're in a position to give moral lectures to children, Olaf," Mr. Poe said sternly. "All right, Dr. Lucafont, you take him." Dr. Lucafont grabbed Count Olaf's shoulder with one of his oddly stiff hands, I keep wanting to say stiffed, hands, and led the way out of the reptile room into the front door, stopping at the doorway to give Mr. Poe and the three children a thin smile. "Say goodbye to the orphans, Count Olaf," Dr. Lucafont said. "Goodbye," Count Olaf said. "Goodbye," Violet said. "Goodbye," Klaus said. Mr. Poe coughed into his handkerchief and gave a sort of disgusted half-wave at Count Olaf, indicating goodbye, but Sunny didn't say anything. Violet and Klaus looked down at her, surprised that she hadn't said yeet, or libo, or any of her various terms for goodbye. But Sunny was staring at Dr. Lucafont with a determined look in her eye, and in a moment she had leapt into the air and bitten him on the hand. "Sunny," Violet said, and was about to apologize for her behavior when she saw Dr. Lucafont's whole hand come loose from his arm and fall to the floor. As Sunny clamped down on it with her four sharp teeth, the hand made a crackling sound, like breaking wood or plastic rather than skin or bone. And when Violet looked at the place where Dr. Lucafont's hand had been, she saw no blood or indication of a wound, but a shiny metal hook. Dr. Lucafont looked at the hook too, and then at Violet, and grinned horribly. Count Olaf grinned too, and in a second the two of them had darted out the door. "The hook-handed man!" Violet shouted. "He's not a doctor, he's one of Count Olaf's henchmen!" Instinctively, Violet grabbed the air where the two men had been standing, but of course they weren't there. She opened the front door wide and saw the two of them sprinting through the snake-shaped hedges. "After them!" Klaus shouted, and the three Baudelaires started to run through the door. But Mr. Poe stepped in front of them and blocked their way. "No!" he cried. "But it's the hook-handed man!" Violet shouted. "He and Olaf will get away." "I can't let you run out after two dangerous criminals," Mr. Poe replied. "I'm responsible for the safety of you children, and I will not have any harm come to you." "Then you go after them!" Klaus cried. "But hurry!" Mr. Poe began to step out the door, but he stopped when he heard the roar of a car engine starting up. The two ruffians, a word which here means horrible people, had reached Dr. Lucafont's car and were already driving away. "Get in the Jeep!" Violet exclaimed. "Follow them!" "A grown man," Mr. Poe said sternly, "does not get involved in a car chase. This is a job for the police. I'll go call them now and maybe they can set up a roadblock." The Baudelaire youngsters watched Mr. Poe shut the door and race to the telephone, and their hearts sank. They knew it was no use. By the time Mr. Poe was through explaining the situation to the police, Count Olaf and the hook-handed man were sure to be long gone. Suddenly exhausted, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny walked to Uncle Monty's enormous staircase and sat down on the bottom step, listening to the faint sound of Mr. Poe talking on the telephone. They knew that trying to find Count Olaf and the hook-handed man, particularly when it grew dark, would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Despite their anxiety over Count Olaf's escape, the three orphans must have fallen asleep for a few hours, and the next thing they knew it was nighttime, and they were still on the bottom step. Somebody had placed a blanket over them, and as they stretched themselves, they saw three men in overalls walking out of the reptile room, carrying some of the reptiles in their cages. Behind them walked a chubby man in a brightly colored plaid suit, who stopped when he saw they were awake. "Hey, kids," the chubby man said in a loud, booming voice. "I'm sorry if I woke you up, but my team has to move quickly." "Who are you?" Violet asked. "It's confusing to fall asleep in the daytime and wake up at night." "What are you doing with Uncle Monty's reptiles?" Klaus asked. "It is also confusing to realize you've been sleeping on stairs rather than in a bed or sleeping bag." "Dick's Nick?" Sunny asked. "It's always confusing why anyone would choose to wear a plaid suit." "The name's Bruce," Bruce said. "I'm the director of marketing for the Herpetological Society. Your friend Mr. Poe called me to come and retrieve the snakes now that Dr. Montgomery has passed on. Retrieve means take away." "We know what the word retrieve means," Klaus said, "but why are you taking them? Where are they going?" "Well, you three are the orphans, right? You'll be moving on to some other relative who won't die on you like Montgomery did. And these snakes need to be taken care of, so we're giving them away to other scientists, zoos, and retirement homes. Those we can't find homes for we'll have to put to sleep." "But they're Uncle Monty's collection!" Klaus cried. "It took him years to find all these reptiles. You can't just scatter them to the winds." "It's the way it has to be," Bruce said smoothly. He was still talking in a very loud voice for no apparent reason. "Viper!" Sunny shouted and began to crawl toward the reptile room. "What my sister means," Violet explained, "is that she's very close friends with one of the snakes. Could we take just one with us, the incredibly deadly viper?" "First off, no," Bruce said. "That guy Poe said all the snakes now belong to us, and second off, if you think I'm going to let small children near the incredibly deadly viper, think again." "But the incredibly deadly viper is harmless," Violet said. "Its name is a misnomer." Bruce scratched his head. "A what?" "It means a wrong name," Klaus explained. "Uncle Monty discovered it, so he got to name it." "This guy was supposed to be brilliant," Bruce said. He reached into a pocket in his plaid jacket and pulled out a cigar. "Giving a snake a wrong name doesn't sound brilliant to me. It sounds idiotic. But then what can you expect from a man whose own name was Montgomery Montgomery?" "It's not nice," Klaus said, "to lampoon someone's name like that." "I don't have time to ask you what lampoon means," Bruce said, "but if the baby here wants to wave bye-bye to the incredibly deadly viper, she'd better do it soon. It's already outside." Sunny began to crawl toward the front door, but Klaus was not through talking to Bruce. "Our Uncle Monty was brilliant," he said firmly. "He was a brilliant man," Violet agreed, "and we will always remember him as such." "Brilliant!" Sunny shrieked in mid-crawl, and her siblings smiled down at her, surprised she had uttered a word that everyone could understand. Bruce lit his cigar and blew smoke into the air and then shrugged. "It's nice you feel that way, kid," he said. "Good luck wherever they put you." He looked at a shiny diamond watch on his wrist and then turned to talk to the men in overalls. "Let's get a move on. In 5 minutes we have to be back on that road that smells like ginger." "It's horseradish," Violet corrected, but Bruce had already walked away. She and Klaus looked at each other and then began following Sunny outside to wave goodbye to their reptile friends. But as they reached the door, Mr. Poe walked into the room and blocked them again. "I see you're awake," he said. "Please go upstairs and go to sleep then. We have to get up very early in the morning." "We just want to say goodbye to the snakes," Klaus said, but Mr. Poe shook his head. "You'll get in Bruce's way," he replied. "Plus, I would think you three would never want to see a snake again." The Baudelaire orphans looked at one another and sighed. Everything in the world seemed wrong. It was wrong that Uncle Monty was dead. It was wrong that Count Olaf and the hook-handed man had escaped. It was wrong for Bruce to think of Monty as a person with a silly name instead of a brilliant scientist. And it was wrong to assume that the children never wanted to see a snake again. The snakes, and indeed everything else in the reptile room, were the last reminders the Baudelaires had of the few happy days they'd spent there at the house. The few happy days they'd had since their parents had perished. Even though they understood that Mr. Poe wouldn't let them live alone with the reptiles, it was all wrong never to see them again, without even saying goodbye. Ignoring Mr. Poe's instructions, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny rushed out the front door where the men in overalls were loading the cages into a van with Herpetological Society written on the back. It was a full moon, and the moonlight reflected off the glass walls of the reptile room as though it were a large jewel with a bright, bright shine. Brilliant, one might say. When Bruce had used the word brilliant about Uncle Monty, he meant having a reputation for cleverness or intelligence. But when the children used the word, and when they thought of it now, staring at the reptile room glowing in the moonlight, it meant more than that. It meant that even in the bleak circumstances of their current situation, even throughout the series of unfortunate events that would happen to them for the rest of their lives, Uncle Monty and his kindness would shine in their memories. Uncle Monty was brilliant, and their time with him was brilliant. Bruce and his men from the Herpetological Society could dismantle Uncle Monty's collection, but nobody could ever dismantle the way that the Baudelaires would think of him. "Goodbye! Goodbye!" the Baudelaire orphans called as the incredibly deadly viper was loaded into the truck. "Goodbye! Goodbye!" they called, and even though the viper was Sunny's special friend, Violet and Klaus found themselves crying along with their sister, and when the incredibly deadly viper looked up to see them, they saw that it was crying too, tiny, shiny tears falling from its green eyes. The viper was brilliant too, and as the children looked at one another, they saw their own tears in the way they shone. "You're brilliant," Violet murmured to Klaus, reading up on the Mamba du Mal. "You're brilliant," Klaus murmured back, getting the evidence out of Stefano's suitcase. Brilliant, Sunny said again, and Violet and Klaus gave their baby sister a hug. Even the youngest Baudelaire was brilliant for distracting the adults with the incredibly deadly viper. Goodbye! Goodbye! The brilliant Baudelaires called and waved to Uncle Monty's reptiles. They stood together in the moonlight and kept waving, even when Bruce shut the doors of the van, even as the van drove past the snake-shaped hedges and down the driveway to Lousy Lane, and even when it turned a corner and disappeared into the dark. That's the end of the Reptile Room. My nose is so itchy for some reason. Alright. That's the end of book number 2 in a series of unfortunate events. I'll read the preview for the next book in a sec. Okay. To my kind editor, I'm writing to you from the shores of Lake Lachrymose, where I'm examining the remains of Aunt Josephine's house in order to completely understand everything that happened when the Baudelaire orphans found themselves here. Please go to the Café Kafka at 4 p.m. next Wednesday and order a pot of jasmine tea from the tallest waiter on duty. Unless my enemies have succeeded, he will bring you a large envelope instead. Inside the envelope you will find my description of these horrific events, entitled The Wide Window, as well as a sketch of Curdled Cave, a small bag of shattered glass, and the menu from the Anxious Clown restaurant. There will also be a test tube containing 1 lachrymose leech so that Mr. Hellquist can draw an accurate illustration. Under no circumstances should this test tube be opened. Remember, you're my last hope that the tales of the Baudelaire orphans can finally be told to the general public. With all due respect, Lemony Snicket. It's over! Thanks, guys, for coming and joining. I hope you enjoyed it. Just to kind of give you an update on my plans for my next few streams. Tomorrow, I will be streaming at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's going to be a birthday stream for Nicole, who's part of the Twitch fam here. She watches a lot of my streams, and it's her birthday on Saturday, so I'm going to throw her a little birthday bash on stream. I don't know what game I'm going to play yet. She hasn't let me know what she wants to see, but when she does, I will be playing whatever she requests. My next book stream is actually going to be the book Secrets Can Kill. Nancy Drew, Secrets Can Kill. I'd like to read the Nancy Drew books that the game series are based on. So, I haven't collected all of them yet, but the ones that I do have, if I go through them slow enough, I think I'll be able to collect them all in time. So that book stream will probably be either Friday morning if I am feeling up to it, or Saturday morning. I don't know times yet, but just make sure that you have my live notifications turned on if you're following me, and you'll get buzzed when I go live. But again, thank you to everybody who was here. I hope you had a good time. Anybody who listened but didn't talk, I hope you had a good time as well. Sorry that the stream was a little shorter today, only a little less than an hour. But I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Hopefully I'll see you again at my stream tomorrow. And much love from me to you. I hope you guys take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.